Group. For the record, it is 5:08 p.m. So we've met before and we're ready to get started. Today's agenda involves a presentation. Chris, can you start recording? Are we recording?
Yeah, I started recording it.
Okay. So today's agenda involves a presentation from AECOM. That's going to take a couple minutes at most. And then you'll have members of the public that want to comment on this initiative will have an opportunity to comment after that. We're happy to answer any questions and we encourage these comments. I serve as the chair of the Upper Rio Grande Planning Group. So anything we're able to assist, please feel free to reach out to me as well. So without further ado, I'll for AECOM to present.
Thank you, Omar. Appreciate that. We've got a little presentation here that's going to touch on the key points of the plan itself. We're not going to go through the whole plan, but we will touch on the key points. Chris, if you can share your screen. Thank you. Again, this is going draft regional flood plan, the feedback from the public. Go ahead, next screen. All right, thank you. Just going to go through some introductions here from our planning team. My name is Gilbert Andujo. I am the project manager. We've got Chris Wright on the line, who's the deputy project manager and part of the technical planning. Well, we're gonna let me just go with this. We're going to do a brief overview of the regional flood planning process and draft Upper Rio Grande Regional Flood Plan, and we're also going to go with the draft RFP comments. Next slide. Go back to the other one.
Every time you see RFP, that's regional flood plan. You're gonna see that happening a lot.
This is the Upper Rio Grande Flood Planning Group, which is being sponsored by the Rio Grande Council of Governments. And this picture up here is what our region entails. We are region 14, and there is 15 total regions, I think, for this particular flood plan. Next slide. So meet our planning team. Again, we've got here Omar Martinez. He's the chair for the Upper Rio Grande Flood Planning Group. We've got Ms. Annette Gutierrez, the executive director.
Hello.
Of the Rio Grande COG. Myself, Gilbert Andujo, with the project manager. Chris Wright, our lead planner. And we also have Brian Blaisdell, our technical consultant, lead planner as well. We also have Alejandra Marco with us. And we've got Barracuda here, which is our public relations team for this. So we've also got our Upper Rio Grande team here, which makes up the members. For agriculture, we have Dr. Shuping Sheng, and he's with Sheng Engineering. We've got Gilbert Saldana Jr., who's representing the counties. He's with El Paso County. We've got Jeff Bennett. He's with the Rio Grande Joint Venture. They're representing environmental interests. We've got the industries, which is Sam Massoud, Del Rio Engineering. Municipalities are being represented by Javier Acosta with FXA. Dave Hall representing the public here. We've got Carlos Arturo Velarde Fernandez, Valverde County, who's representing the public as well. We've got small businesses, Rene Rodriguez. Water districts are Omar Martinez, sitting to the right of me. We've got water utilities, Ms. Isela Dardino with EP Water. And Mr. Enrique Ochoa and Marvin Gomez are alternate members that have served on this board as well. And other water utilities is Levi Bryant. I didn't leave anybody off, right? We're going to go over now a regional review of the regional flood planning process. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Gilbert. So I'm just going to go over the flood planning process briefly from a high level, and then we are going to look at each chapter of the floodplain, also of the regional flood plan or RFP, as you might see it referred to in the slides. But we're not going to spend a lot of detail, a lot of time on each chapter. We're just going to give you a high level overview what's in each chapter. And then we'll open it up to any public comments that anybody would like to make during the meeting. So the regional flood plan came about through Senate Bill 8 in 2019, which established regional and state flood plans. The state of Texas is organized into 15 total regions and planning groups, and they will be updated on a 5-year planning cycle, similar to the state water plan. This is our region, as Gilbert mentioned earlier. We have 23 counties. You can see that some of the counties only include portions within our region. These regions are based on watersheds. Ours is the Upper Rio Grande, and it stretches from Amistad Reservoir to El Paso. It also includes the Pecos River and the Devils River. A big part of the regional flood planning process is developing flood management evaluations, or FMEs, flood mitigation projects, or FMPs, and flood management strategies, or FMSs. So you might see these acronyms throughout this presentation. Just to give you a quick description of each one, flood management evaluation is like a study that needs to be done. For example, if an area doesn't have any FEMA floodplain mapping, you might need an FME to be done before you can come up with a project, because you first need to know where the flood risk is, how many buildings are at risk, and then based on that information, after that study has been done and maybe some conceptual project ideas have been developed, you might have enough information to then have a flood mitigation project, or an FMP. And a flood mitigation project requires a certain amount of analysis, which includes developing a benefit cost ratio. It includes evaluating impacts, both positive and negative impacts, potential negative impacts to adjacent properties or downstream properties. There are different set of analyses required for FMEs that are in the plan versus FMPs. Now, an FMS, or a flood management strategy, is sort of a catch-all for anything that doesn't fall into the FME or FMP category. If you, for example, have a overall plan that is for flood protection, but maybe it involves recurring costs, like a maintenance plan. For this picture shows someone in the Rio Grande, measuring some of the vegetation there, surveying some of the vegetation. That's something that would fall into the FMS category because it has a recurring cost. Or there might be multiple FMPs that are part of a larger strategy to reduce flooding in a larger area. So you can have some FMPs that are also part of an FMS. Similarly, you can have FMEs that are part of an FMS. But the reason we make these distinctions are because what you end up submitting them as in the regional flood plan, all the regional flood plans eventually get rolled into the state flood plan, and it will be a requirement for future funding by the TWDB that if they're going to administer state funds for flood reduction studies or projects, then they have to be in the plan. And if it's in the plan as an FME, then that means it will meet that eligibility criteria. It doesn't mean it'll necessarily get the funding, but it'll be a requirement that it's in the plan to get funding for a study in the future. If it's in the plan as an FMP, then that means it will meet the minimum requirements to get funding for a final design or construction of the project. So just to clarify, if it's in the plan as an FME, it doesn't mean that it can get funding for final design and construction. It would need to be in there as an FMP and possibly an FMS, depending on the nature of that FMS. The regional flood plans will identify the flood risk and, as I mentioned, recommended FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs within each region. And the state flood plan will rank the recommended FMEs, FMSs, FMPs statewide from each region. And then, as I mentioned, future state financial assistance will be determined based on those rankings and in the overall what's included in the plan. This is a project roadmap that gives you some high-level bullets on major milestones. We're right here in summer of 2022. The draft regional flood plan has been presented to the public. We're discussing it at this is the public meeting, but we actually posted it 30 days ago on August 14th in 3 locations throughout the region, which we'll talk about in a later slide. And the next step down the road is in the winter of 22, where we will adopt the regional flood plan. And now I will go into each chapter. As I mentioned, I'll just do a brief high-level overview about what's in the chapters to give you an idea of the content in the regional flood plan for this Upper Rio Grande, Region 14. So this was submitted as a draft format August 1st. It's also posted on the Upper Rio Grande website at urgfp.org for public review. The public comment period is from August 14th through October 14th. So there's 30 days left to submit comments. They can be submitted during this public meeting in person, or you can email Annette at AnnetteG@riocog.org, or you can mail in hard copies of your comments to the Rio Grande Council of Governments. Please place attention for Annette Gutierrez at 8037 Lockheed, Suite 100, El Paso, Texas, 79925. So Chapter 1, this is kind of an introduction to the overall plan. It focuses on social and economic characteristics of the region, agricultural and natural resources. It has a list of historic flood events and some discussion. It lists out the flood-related authorities and regulation. I should mention there's also a geodatabase, a spatial geodatabase, which is part of the submittal, the draft submittal, and that has those flood-related authorities and regulation boundaries in GIS format. We talk about existing and natural flood mitigation features as well as constructed major flood infrastructure. We discuss proposed or ongoing major flood infrastructure. These are and mitigation projects. Just to clarify, these are not projects we came up with as part of the plan. These are projects that have already been funded, and they might already be under construction or in the final design phase. But the main thing I want to point out is these are proposed or ongoing projects with committed funding. And lastly, we also have a list of relevant planning documents. If there were stormwater master plans considered, that would be in there. If there were future land use plans, that's also in this chapter. A list of those references. Chapter 2 discusses excuse me, available hydrologic and hydraulic models. We had to develop risk maps for the whole region, so we used the best available floodplains and modeling that were in each area. So we coordinated with stakeholders to get that information, so we could come up with 1% annual chance or 100-year and 0.2% annual chance or 500-year floodplain boundaries. These were used throughout the regional flood plan to try to focus on where solutions are needed, such as FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs. We evaluated the location, the magnitude, and the frequency of flooding. We looked at flood exposure, which is basically what populations, what critical facilities, which areas are harmed, and the vulnerabilities as well in the region. So if there is like I said, a critical facility like a hospital or an area of large public gatherings, water treatment plants, that type of structure is considered a critical facility, then we would look at those vulnerabilities as well. And we would also discuss the loss of function of those critical facilities if they were to be flooded. Chapter 3, we discussed it's called the floodplain management practices and goals. We evaluate the floodplain management practices throughout the region, throughout the different communities. 75% of eligible communities participate in the National Flood Insurance Program within the region. City of El Paso is the only one that's recognized at this time for meeting higher than minimum floodplain standards. The NFIP is a program that provides funding for flood insurance through FEMA. So participation in that program would be required if you want. So if there's some sort of disaster and you need insurance funding for flooded residences or buildings. It also has recommendations for minimum standards and best practices, as well as flood mitigation, floodplain management goals. Now, these goals were developed in coordination with the Regional Flood Planning Group. Through flood planning group meetings, we came up with 21 short-term goals, which are considered within a 10-year time frame, and 7 long-term goals, which are within a 30-year time frame. Those are listed in this chapter. Chapter 4 is identification of flood mitigation needs and solutions. So these are the FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs that we discussed earlier. This is the chapter where we talk about the process that we use to develop these with the RFPG. There's a flood mitigation needs analysis that was documented in this chapter where we used best available flood risk mapping that we talked about in chapter 2 to find, where are the communities that have the most structures at risk, where are the most critical facilities or low water crossings impacted by flooding. And it also outlines the process that we used to develop FMEs, FMSs, FMPs. In our region, we had a workshop with stakeholders where we discussed flood events and what went right, what went wrong, how can we improve the reaction to those flood events and be more prepared in the future. It has maps 16, 17, and 18, which all show the extent of each FME, FMP, and FMS respectively within the region. And the appendices for this chapter are very dense. They include narratives as well as evaluation tables, which show multiple, basically a myriad of data for each of these FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs. It's very well documented. We analyzed each one of them according to the TWDB requirements for each type of flood solution. So as I mentioned, there's a narrative which discusses each one, and then there's an overall table which has the data such as how many buildings are flooded, how many critical facilities are at risk, what populations are at risk, how many low water crossings, that type of information. Chapter 5 identifies which FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs were recommended as part of the plan. So just because we identified in chapter 4, based on those evaluations that we did, we then presented to the RFPG, okay, these are the ones we think we should recommend. In our case, all of the FMEs, FMSs, FMPs that were identified and fully evaluated were also recommended in the plan. But we talk about that recommendation process, and we also include exhibit maps, which are what we call map books. So these ones have an index map at the start that show, where each following map is located on that throughout the region. And then following that index map, we've got a zoomed in map of each flood solution for all the FMEs, FMSs, FMPs. So you can kind of see the zoomed in. For example, this shows an FMP and the buildings at risk in the floodplain downstream of where we're proposing this detention facility. We also include descriptions of no negative impact, how we assessed that the project would not cause adverse impacts to adjacent or downstream properties, And we have narratives that talk about the detailed analyses where we developed hydrologic and hydraulic models for FMPs or FMSs. And it has a comprehensive summary table that talks about all impacts of projects, not just positive or negative, but both positive and negative in a range of areas, such as environmental, or if there was an impact to the water supply. We mentioned that. If there's social economic impacts, those are all summarized in a summary table within Chapter 5. Chapter 6 goes into a little bit more detail about some of those impacts that I just talked about. It gives an overall summary of the amount of structures, or actually breaks it down into several different categories, like number of low water crossings and critical facilities. For example, the total number of structures removed from the 100-year or 1% annual chance floodplain, if we were to perform all of the FMPs and FMSs, would be a total of 11,964, or a population of 31,233 would be benefited. It also talks about the 0.2% or 500-year annual chance, and gives 936 structures, 2,400 population would be benefited, and it would remove 41 low water crossings for all the FMPs, FMSs. We also talk about contributions to the water supply in more detail in this chapter. There was only one project that was recommended as a strategy in FMS in our plan, and it was a requirement if it does impact water supply or contribute to water supply, and to get that documented, it also has to be part of the state water plan, which this one was part of the Region E, or the Far West water plan. So we have a map here that shows where the state water plan regions line up compared to our region. So the yellow, blue, and green are 3 different state water plan regions, and our region is shown in black here. So you can see that they're not exactly the same, but this one was in the city of Alpine, irrigation and recharge application of captured rainwater runoff, and it's part of Region J, the Plateau region. Oh, I'm sorry, it was part of Region E, the Far West Texas, apologies. And it did not have any negative impacts to water supply, and it did contribute to the water supply, and we quantified that in this chapter based on information that was presented in the state water plan and provided by some of the stakeholders during the flood planning process. And there are no FMPs or FMSs that are estimated to negatively impact the water supply. That statement is in this chapter as well. Chapter 7 is on flood response information and activities. So we talk about the difference between flood mitigation, flood preparedness, flood response, and flood recovery. Flood mitigation isn't really discussed in detail in this chapter, because that's basically what the whole rest of the plan is about. But we do talk about flood preparedness, which is basically the actions aside from mitigation that are taken before a flood event to prepare for flood response activities, whereas flood response is taken during and in the immediate aftermath of the flood event. Recovery is actions following the flood event, which involve repairs or other actions necessary to return to pre-event conditions. And so we have examples of each of those listed here. We did put out a public survey to ask the people filling out that survey, who do they coordinate with during a disaster or a flood event, and these are the results. And whether it's after a flood event or during or before a flood event, we documented that in this table. Chapter 8 is on administrative, regulatory, and legislative recommendations. There were 3 recommendations made for the El Paso County area stakeholders, and two legislative recommendations for areas outside of El Paso County. These were made in subcommittee meetings. We developed a subcommittee specifically for this chapter and this task. And so I've listed what those legislative recommendations are, both inside El Paso and outside here in the slide. But there are also regulatory administrative recommendations, and in addition to those legislative, there were 13 recommendations in the El Paso area and 8 outside of El Paso. Apologies, I know this is a pretty busy slide, but I just wanted, so chapter 9 was on flood infrastructure financing, and this just gives you an idea, this table on the right, of all the different types of funding agencies and programs that are available. But this chapter talks, it kind of summarizes if you add up all the FMEs, FMPs, and FMSs, you've got their totals here in this table. They add up to a total of 58. And if you add up all the estimated costs, it comes out to 160 million. And they are proposed to get funding from local, state, and federal sources. We also talk about barriers to some of those funding programs, or getting funding for those flood solutions. We did send out a flood infrastructure financing survey to the sponsors that we identified for each FME, FMS, and FMP. The survey had 9 questions. 29 entities were contacted, and we received 11 responses, so that's a 38% response rate. We received responses for 79% of the FMEs, FMPs, and FMSs, so 46 out of the 58 responded for that, for each one of those. Lastly, we looked at, out of the total amount, the 160.3 million, how much of that was needing assistance from either the state or the federal government, and we found that 96% of the funding is needed outside of the local sponsors. Lastly, we covered chapter 10 is public participation in plan adoption. This summarizes the different public outreach events that we conducted as part of the plan. We had several RFPG meetings. I think our region in particular was like the second most in the state out of all the other regions. We had 4 open house events. We started the plan early on with 3 roadhouse, or sorry, we called them road meetings. I forget the term we came up with, but they're basically open house meetings in cities of El Paso, city of Pecos, and city of Presidio. Roadshow meetings, that's what we called them. Basically, we took it to the road, and it was great. You know, we met a lot of the public stakeholders. We brought maps that they could write on. You can see some pictures of them putting their notes on stickies. We had them, fill out information in our online geodatabase where they were able to draw polygons spatially on the computer where they knew there was flooding, or if they had flood solution ideas. It was a great way to collect input early on in the process. Then we had a wrap-up meeting in El Paso at the end, where we showed our solutions, our FMEs, FMSs, FMPs that we came up with and got feedback. As I mentioned, we also sent out surveys at the beginning to collect information, a public survey, and we conducted a funding survey, which was sent to stakeholders and sponsors, specifically about the FMEs, FMS, FMPs in their areas. So we also discussed the alignment of the draft RFP with the Texas Administrative Code, which is this 362.3. And that's all I have. That, like I said, just want to give a general overview. And at this point, I think I'll turn it back to Omar, or I'm not sure if Annette is taking it from here, but we will open it up to any comments from the public if anyone wants to speak.
There were 2 slides that were probably really hard for these people to see.
Okay.
And what was on their slide for chapter 7 that stuff that was on the right, that maybe if we,
Graph.
yeah,
I'll go print them up right now.
okay, just
Yeah.
the two
What,
critical
what
ones,
slide was it?
7 and
The
7
one
and
that had
9.
the little graph on.
Okay, 7 and 9?
Yeah.
Okay,
Just in case you wanted to see the entity coordination before, during, and after, which entities had the highest response. And also for chapter 9, where those funding comes from. So you can get an idea of where we're talking about seeing funding.
Anyway, moving on to agenda item number 4, public input. At this point, the regional planning group is requesting input from anybody here, anybody joining us online. And you can also do this post-meeting by sending out an email to Gutierrez or even mail and that. But at this point, we're looking for input as we are required by Texas Water Code and Texas Administrative Code. Having said that, I'm also opening it up to if your comments are not necessarily towards the plan, but general public comments, I think we can quote some opinions. I don't know what kind of feedback you all might have. I know we have folks from the city of El Paso here joining us that might have some good feedback for us.
Actually, today was the first time I opened the document.
If you could identify who
My
you
name is
are.
Tony de la Cruz. Tony de la Cruz, I'm work for the city of El Paso with the planning and inspection department. So I hadn't seen the document and I said, okay, I'll review it really quickly. And then I saw how much there was. So I really had a chance to review the document and provide any relevant comments at this point. The only question that I had was, is there any correlation between this plan and the proposed FEMA floodplain maps that are due to come out eventually?
They're kind of correlated in a way, but they kind of have an own, I mean, the FEMA floodplain maps are, I think, basically because
Yeah, so the FEMA flood,
Telling.
Stella Lagnino, with stormwater, El Paso water. And, with the FEMA, for the FEMA flood maps, that one, we worked together, city, El Paso Water, the county, worked together with FEMA on the development of these maps, and we reviewed them and we've already provided comments. The data that they use for the models to develop these maps is based on the drainage design manual that the city of El Paso, in EP Water and county use. So that we're working directly with FEMA. On this one, we're working with Texas Water, and that's only for that county of El Paso City and Paso. This is for the entire region, and you guys are using Atlas 14 numbers, right? Because there's not a specific study that with data that we can use. So the best available data for the entire region is Atlas 14, so which was developed by NOAA. Yes, so that's what we're using on this one. So and like I said, for the FEMA flood maps, we submitted comments that county developers, citizens, and FEMA's working on those, and those have been put on hold because they're addressing all those comments. So this, in essence, it's also looking at the entire drainage area and the problem areas, and where there's information that we can use, and where there's lack of information, where we need to get more data so that we can identify the problem areas and develop studies, evaluations, and propose projects so that we can address those drainage. So they're kind of similar, but they're not. They're in independent.
And I'll add that this plan, the regional flood plan, does not have any regulatory enforcement authority. All it is a resource so that any entity that's looking to implement strategies in the plan can access the Texas Water Development Board's future flood infrastructure fund These are, the last round, it was $1.5 billion that were available. City of Socorro, benefited $40 million worth of funding from that. It's a completely different funding pool from FEMA, your hazard mitigation, and all this other funding pool. And then it's got its own benefits. So FEMA's methodology, for example, for benefit cost analysis, are very particular, very specific. The Texas Water Development Board allows you to propose alternatives, which makes some projects that are not viable for FEMA funding very viable for the flood infrastructure plan. So it's an alternate approach, a state-driven approach to solve flooding issues. It's an additional resource, and we're hoping to get, we have El Paso Water, but the city of El Paso more involved in this process.
FEMA is a regulatory agency, and that information is used to develop the flood maps and that, which that's what's used to pay for flood insurance when you're still have a mortgage in your home. And that's what's regulatory. And this is more so that we can have the means and information ready for whenever there's grant opportunities, we can apply for grant for those projects, and we can make a better use of our money. Because it's a cost here. So instead of the entity, the county paying or the municipality paying for 100% of the project cost, it's a percentage that we will.
And to give you an example, City of Socorro in their last $10 million project, I think they did like 33% grant, and then the rest was a zero interest loan, which they can take their time to finance it accordingly. Very different from FEMA, and then if you have to use like bonds or local revenues, it's just a completely different financing model.
And EP Water also benefited from this last round of grant opportunity. We got one of our projects funded as well. So I think we got about a $5 million grant and then a $9 million loan. And the rest, of course, we're paying with from our people. So it's very beneficial. And that's the reason we want to get as many projects in there as we can. And if you have drainage issues in your area or in areas that you know of, we want to make sure that that's identified somewhere in the plan. So whenever there's grant opportunities, we can apply for those projects and make it better for everybody.
Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else have any comments?
I have a question. I'm from the Bar in the Bucks-Cook County, and I serve as the director on the Texas State Water Conservation District. And I know you guys talk a lot about the local El Paso, but our smaller communities like El City, Port Hancock, Sierra Blanca, places like that. What's out there for us?
I'm happy to help answer that. So obviously, Joanna McKinney.
Yes.
Okay. So Joanna, we, as part of this process, we helped, and AECOM was involved. We helped her secure an earmark from Congressman Tony Gonzalez to start addressing some of the flooding issues. I'm not entirely up to date on how that's worked out thus far, but Hudson County has benefited from it already. So now we're talking funding. Hudson County is included in the plan. There are flood mitigation strategies. We work with Joanna and other stakeholders like the irrigation district. And so, again, we've gotten their input since, for example, the irrigation district collects that stormwater, puts them in their lakes and uses them for irrigation. So we're very familiar with Hudson County situation. There's strategies in the plan specifically for Hudson County, and it's the same story for the more rural counties throughout the 23 county region. So here we're in El Paso and we have plenty of El Paso stakeholders. And that's why I'm guessing there was a concentration there. But our priority was every community gets their due diligence. Every community gets an opportunity to share their story, and AECOM developed strategies for every.
And that's something that was discussed very early on, that we wanted to be able to address everybody who can spread the work and spread the improvements throughout the region. That's why it's a regional group, and we have representatives from the different areas, but that's something that I think everybody in this group has in mind, that we're here, representing, in my case, cities, in somebody else's case, a municipality. But the end in mind is to benefit the entire.
Just as an here, they reviewing in a 1 o'clock meeting today, FMEs to perform as a part of task 12, which is coming up. And communities in there, Reeves County, Brewster County, Warren County, Winkler, Crockett County, Presidio County, Sutton, El Paso County, Presidio again, Pecos, Hudspeth, just so you can see the cross section. One of the things I've tried to do, which Gilbert knows a lot about, is to make sure that we pay attention to other people. I was in the water planning group also, and we had a big issue when that plan first started between rural and urban. And I wanted to make sure that there wasn't any kind of an issue like that when we did this. So we've been paying a great deal of attention to places away from El Paso.
And as a final note, when we say pay attention, it also means budget wise. So this is a $1.7 million initiative in general.
Right.
So we make sure that it was distributed equitably, especially to the rural areas. We understand that there's more people, structures, and strategies in El Paso County because that's the largest population center. Nevertheless, ICOM was directed to go to those small communities and spend what they need to make sure that their strategies are developed as well.
Barracuda's done a really good job with that.
I asked a lot about this because our area, of course, El Paso has a great deal of investment in our area, buying for our water. And, you know, we flooded back in the 60s and 66. And we've got 4 watershed dams, and I'm currently working with JoJo and with my board and trying to get some grants to take care of that. And, you know, I know it's a great deal that, you know, El Paso Water has a big stake in Mill City. So, you know, it is interesting that we need to take care of it for long-term use.
You're very right. Any further comments? Anybody else that might want to join this? We had somebody from TechStop?
Tony Santana.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi.
Sir, I'm not sure if you had an opportunity to listen to the full presentation or you had a chance to see the document itself. TechStop is a very vital partner in this. Many of our flooding issues have to do with, especially I-10. And so upstream and downstream development and that link and the concern that like TechStop doesn't always take into account downstream impact when they're developing. And so I'm wondering if you've had any chance to review the plan and if you have plans to submit comments throughout this initiative.
Yeah, no, I haven't had a chance to look at the report. I did assist in providing some documentation for one of our town country highways, but now that I'm here and at this document, I'll go online to the link and review it and provide some comments.
Thank you. Is there anybody joining us from the public that would like to make a comment through Zoom?
Somebody has their.
Jason.
Okay, Jason Garcia.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to introduce myself briefly. My name is Jason Garcia. I'm master planning here on Fort Bliss, and I'm currently reviewing a lot of this plan with my colleagues here on Fort Bliss, and I will provide comments once we get those, I guess, those pages and coordination together with everyone. I will provide the comments to you guys. And I just want to let you know that Fort Bliss is on board with anything that is needed. And I know a lot of the flood issues are within the Fort Bliss boundary. And I just want to let you know that we're on board with anything that is needed. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia.
Appreciate that. Just remember, we got till the 14th of October to receive comments. 30 days from today.
Yes. I have already distributed to all the stakeholders here on Fort Bliss, and I will provide comments before the due date. Over.
Thank you. Is there anybody else joining us online that would like to make a comment? Okay. Hearing none.
I think maybe before we adjourn, just to let everybody know that if you're interested in participating in our general meetings or just listening to our general meetings, because we have those virtual, we'll have our website available for you, so you can make sure that you get the agendas that way, and then you can just click on the link automatically from there. So I think that this plan has been effective only because there's been just as much participation from the communities as there has been from the subcontractor, from the consultants, AECom. So I looked to Hudspeth County because if Joanna hadn't been as loud as she was, what you all needed in terms of that representation, then some of these projects may have not come forward, because there's only so much that we can do to try to figure out what the needs are. So I think that's why it's been a lot more effective for our region because of that, because we've been able to get people to the table and talk about their issues. So they don't stop after this. So if you all have any concerns, continue to have the concerns, just please reach out to the planning group, and we can let you know what the status is and what other funding opportunities there could be.
Let's bring on this public meeting to the end. At this point, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Second.
Well, glad to see you all.
Yes, Dr.
Hey,
B.
Zuby.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Nobody.
All in favor, please indicate by saying
Say aye now.
aye.
Aye.
Bye.